What would happen if I told you that the darkest chapter of modern history was designed so that you would never know about it? What would happen if I told you that behind every burned document, behind every code word, behind every mass grave wiped from the face of the earth, there existed a deliberate, meticulous, obsessive plan so that you, so that I, so that the entire world would never know what really happened? We are not talking about conspiracy theories. We are talking about documented facts, about declassified archives, about confessions extracted in courtrooms where the perpetrators, cornered, could no longer keep lying. We are talking about the secrets of the Holocaust that Adolf Hitler never explained. Before you settle in, take a moment to give a good like to the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world, because this is not just any story. This is the story they tried to erase. And now, piece by piece, we are going to reconstruct it. Let's think about something for a moment. When someone commits a crime, a single crime, they leave evidence, fingerprints, documents, witnesses. Now, imagine a crime of such a colossal magnitude that involves millions of victims, thousands of perpetrators, hundreds of facilities spread across an entire continent. And even so, the responsible parties tried to ensure that not a single trace remained. How do you erase a crime of that scale? How do you hide something that affected 6 million human beings? The answer is chilling. And it begins with one word: language. The Nazis did not speak of murders. They did not speak of extermination. They did not speak of gas chambers. They used a code, a vocabulary designed so that if any document fell into the wrong hands, no one could understand what it really meant. Evacuation did not mean moving people to a safe place. Evacuation meant death. Resettlement did not mean a new life in the East. Resettlement meant direct deportation to the gas chambers. Special treatment did not mean medical attention. It meant execution. And the final solution to the Jewish question, that bureaucratic, cold, calculated phrase, meant the systematic, planned, and industrialized murder of all the Jews of Europe, every single one of them, without exception. And who decided that this coded language would be the norm? Who established that the greatest genocide in modern history had to be covered with a cloak of euphemisms? The answer takes us to a villa by a lake in the suburbs of Berlin on a winter day in 1942. But before getting there, we need to understand something fundamental. We need to understand why Hitler never signed the order. That is right. Read that again. Or rather, listen to it again. No document ever found bears the signature of Adolf Hitler ordering the Holocaust. Historians like Ian Kershaw, Raoul Hilberg, and Martin Brosser have confirmed that there is not a single paper, a single decree, a single written directive that says, in Hitler's words, exterminate the Jews. Does this mean that Hitler was not responsible? Absolutely not. And this is where the true mystery begins. Because the absence of that signature was not an accident, it was part of the plan. To understand why Hitler avoided leaving written evidence, we need to go back a little in time. We need to talk about the T4 program. In the early years of the Nazi regime, Hitler authorized a program for the murder of people with physical and mental disabilities. It was known as the T4 program for the address of the central offices in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. Unlike what would happen later with the final solution, this program was indeed authorized in writing. A document existed, and when the news of these murders began to leak among the German population, the reaction was strong. There were protests, there was outrage, there was even a documented incident in the city of Hof, where an angry mob directly confronted the policies of the regime. Hitler, cornered by public opinion, was forced to officially cancel the program. Officially, because in practice, the murders continued in secret. But that experience taught him a lesson that would change the way the Nazi regime would operate from then on. It taught him that crimes of this magnitude had to be executed in the shadows, without signed documents, without a written trail that could link him directly, without evidence that could provoke a public reaction like the one he had witnessed with the T4 program. And thus, the strategy of absolute secrecy was born. Hitler gave verbal orders, spoken instructions, directives that passed from mouth to mouth, from officer to officer, without leaving a trace on paper. When Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, met with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in East Prussia, on the 18th of December 1941, he took a handwritten note after his conversation with the Führer. That note said simply, "Jewish question, exterminate as partisans." A single line, written by hand, without Hitler's signature. But for historians, that line is one of the most direct pieces of evidence that it was Hitler who gave the verbal order to set the genocide in motion. But if Hitler never signed the order, how do we know with certainty that he was responsible? How can we state that the machinery of death did not operate by its own inertia, independent of the will of its supreme leader? Here is where the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together, and each piece is more disturbing than the previous one. Let's take the testimony of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of extermination. Eichmann, captured in Argentina in 1960 by agents of the Israeli Mossad, was taken to trial in Jerusalem. And in that trial, under oath, he declared that Reinhard Heydrich had told him directly, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." Those words, direct, without euphemisms, without code. The Führer has ordered. He did not suggest, he did not hint, he ordered. And it was not only Eichmann. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, wrote in his memoirs that Himmler summoned him in the summer of 1941 and told him, in essence, "The Führer has ordered that the Jewish question be resolved once and for all, and we, the SS, must implement that order." Later on, according to the memoirs of Felix Kirsten, Himmler's personal masseur, the head of the SS himself confessed to him that the order to exterminate the Jews came expressly from Hitler and had been delegated to him for its execution. Do you see the pattern? Hitler orders verbally. His subordinates execute. The paper remains clean. And if anyone looks for the signed document, they will not find it, because it never existed. And that is precisely the point. Hitler himself designed it that way. Now then, does this mean there is no documentary evidence at all? No. And here we arrive at one of the most shocking revelations of this entire story, because the Nazis, despite their efforts to destroy all evidence, left an enormous trail. Hundreds of thousands of documents, letters, memorandums, architectural blueprints of the gas chambers, purchase invoices for Zyklon B, the gas used to murder the victims, recorded speeches, written confessions, official and clandestine photographs, German and Allied filmings, and perhaps the most shuddering of all, the written testimonies buried beneath the earth of the extermination camps themselves. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that villa by the lake. Let's go back to the 20th of January, 1942. Let's go back to the Wannsee Conference. Imagine a peaceful place, an elegant mansion on the shores of Lake Großer Wannsee, in the outskirts of Berlin. It is winter. Snow covers the gardens. The interior is heated. There is a table carefully set, and around that table 15 officials of the Nazi regime sit down for what, at first glance, appears to be just another bureaucratic meeting. But what will be discussed at that table during the next few hours will change the course of human history forever. The meeting was convened by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office and one of the most powerful subordinates of Heinrich Himmler. Heydrich had a twofold objective. First, to inform the representatives of the various ministries and government agencies about the implementation of the final solution. And second, to make it clear that it was Hitler himself who had entrusted him and the RSHA with the coordination of the entire operation. It was not a session to debate whether the plan should be carried out. That decision was already made at the highest level of the regime. It was about coordinating the logistics. the logistics of mass murder on a continental scale. The 15 attendees were not lowly foot soldiers or low-ranking fanatics. They were high-level officials. Half of them were under 40 years old. 10 held university degrees. 8 of those 10 were doctors in their respective fields. 8 were lawyers, educated people, trained in the best universities of Germany. And seated around that table, they discussed with absolute coldness how to murder 11 million Jews. 11 million. That was the number that Adolf Eichmann, head of Jewish affairs for the RSHA, had prepared in a detailed list for the conference. 11 million people spread across all of Europe, from Ireland to the Urals, from Norway to North Africa. Country by country, territory by territory, every Jewish community accounted for with bureaucratic precision. Some numbers were inaccurate. Some countries were not even under German control, but the ambition of the plan was total, absolute. Europe was to be combed from west to east, according to the terminology of the protocol, to capture every single Jew. Heydrich spoke for almost an hour. Then followed about 30 minutes of questions and comments. And this is where the story becomes even more disturbing, because according to Eichmann's own later testimony, no one opposed. Not a single person at that table raised an objection. No one said this is a crime. No one said this is wrong. No one said we cannot do this. On the contrary, Josef Bühler, State Secretary of the General Government of occupied Poland, expressed his enthusiastic support for the plan and his desire for the murders to begin as soon as possible in his territory. As soon as possible. And at the end of the meeting, when the formalities gave way to a more relaxed conversation and cognac was served, the masks fell completely. Eichmann would later recall that the gentlemen present discussed the topic with absolute frankness, very different from the language I had to use later in the minutes. They spoke openly of methods of annihilation, of liquidation, of extermination, without euphemisms, without code, with cognac in hand and an apparently clear conscience. And the minutes of that meeting, known as the Wannsee Protocol, were drafted by Eichmann himself, under direct instructions from Heydrich, and following the policy of concealment that defined the regime, nothing too explicit was to appear in the document. Eichmann admitted it in his trial. Certain overly direct expressions and jargon had to be converted by me into office language. The result was a document of 15 pages, marked as Secret Reich Matter, of which some 30 copies were distributed among the various government offices and the SS. Most of those copies disappeared during the war, but one, copy number 16, survived. It was discovered in 1947 by Robert Kempner, a German-born lawyer of Jewish descent who had been expelled from Germany by the Nazis in the 1930s. Kempner found that document among the files of the German Foreign Ministry, and that single copy, that copy number 16 that the Nazis failed to destroy, became one of the most important pieces of evidence of the Nuremberg trials and of all Holocaust historiography. Think about that for a moment. If that copy had been destroyed like the rest, one of the most revealing documents about the planning of the genocide would have disappeared forever. The Nazis were 29 copies away from achieving exactly that. But the Wannsee Conference was not the beginning of the extermination. By the time those 15 bureaucrats sat down to coordinate the details, the machinery of death was already in motion. In June of 1941, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads, had already begun the mass murder of Jews in the occupied eastern territories. Mass shootings, mass graves, entire villages wiped off the map. In Babi Yar, on the outskirts of Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days, the 29th and 30th of September 1941. But the shootings presented logistical problems for the Nazis. They were slow, they consumed ammunition, and most relevant to the regime's leaders, they had a devastating psychological effect on the executioners themselves, the soldiers who fired day after day at unarmed civilians, including children, suffered nervous breakdowns, alcoholism, traumas. The method had to change, and this is where the industrialization of death reaches its most sinister expression. In December 1941, the first experiments with engine exhaust gas in trucks began in Chełmno, in occupied Poland. The first extermination camp opened its doors that same month, and in the following months, the network expanded. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Birkenau, each one designed with a specific purpose: to kill the greatest number of people in the shortest time possible, and to do it in secret. In secret, yes, because even though we are talking about industrial death facilities that process thousands of people every day, the Nazi regime did everything possible so that the outside world, and even a large part of its own population, did not know exactly what was happening. And this is perhaps one of the most disturbing secrets of all. How much did the German population really know? How much did the Allies know? And how much did they choose not to know? Let's pause here, because what comes next is as revealing as it is unsettling. We are going to explore the layers of secrecy that surrounded the Holocaust, from the linguistic codes we already mentioned, to the cover-up operations the Nazis set in motion. When the war began to be lost, we are going to talk about Operation 1005, the Nazi plan to destroy all physical evidence of the mass murders. We are going to talk about Himmler's secret speeches, where the head of the SS spoke openly of the extermination before a select group of generals, making it clear to them that this was a secret that should never be revealed publicly. And we are going to talk about the documents declassified decades after the war that revealed how much the intelligence services of the United States and Great Britain knew while the Holocaust was in full swing. Are you ready? Because each revelation is more shocking than the last. Let's begin with the Posen speeches. On the 4th of October 1943 in the city of Posen, in occupied Poland, Heinrich Himmler addressed a group of SS generals in what was supposed to be an absolutely confidential meeting. And in that speech, Himmler did something unusual, something extraordinarily revealing. He spoke openly of the extermination, without euphemisms, without code, directly. He said before those generals that they could speak of the matter openly among themselves, but that they would never discuss it in public, that they had had the fortitude not to speak of it among themselves, and that they never would. And then, with a coldness that makes one shudder, he pronounced the words the historians have analysed for decades. I'm referring now to the evacuation of the Jews, to the extermination of the Jewish people. The evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. In a single sentence, Himmler connected the euphemism with the reality. Evacuation meant extermination, and he said it openly, before witnesses, but witnesses who were bound by oath to keep the secret. And why was it Himmler who gave this speech and not Hitler? Because as we have seen, Hitler never spoke directly of the extermination in an explicit manner in documents or recorded speeches. His strategy was calculated ambiguity. He made veiled references. He alluded to his prophecy of January 1939, when he publicly warned that if international Jewish financiers provoked another world war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In 1942, at the very peak of the Holocaust, Hitler made public reference to this prophecy at least 4 times. He did not say explicitly, "We are killing Jews." He said, "My prophecy is being fulfilled." And those who knew the real meaning of those words understood perfectly. It is a terrifying form of communication. The supreme leader of the regime makes public statements that for the common citizen sound like political rhetoric, but for the initiated, for those who know the code, they are direct confirmations that the machinery of death is functioning according to plan. But what about the German population? Did they really not know what was happening? Here the historical evidence presents a complex and frankly uncomfortable panorama. Historian Peter Longerich has argued that by 1943, the extermination of the Jews was an open secret among the German population. People knew. Perhaps they did not know every detail, Perhaps they did not know the exact names of the extermination camps or the specific methods, but they knew that something terrible was happening. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front talked. Rumours circulated. Foreign radio broadcasts, though forbidden, were listened to clandestinely by those who had suitable receivers. In 1943, in a special court in Munich, a woman was prosecuted for having discussed with her neighbour the content of foreign broadcasts that described how Jewish women and children were segregated from the Aryan population and then murdered with gas. In 1944, also in Munich, an Augsburg furniture mover was prosecuted for having declared that the Führer was a mass murderer who loaded Jews into train cars and exterminated them with gas. These court cases are revealing not only for what they say about public knowledge, but because they demonstrate that the regime actively persecuted those who spoke about it. If the extermination was such a well-kept secret, why was it necessary to prosecute people for mentioning it? After the war, the most repeated phrase in Germany was, "Davon haben wir nichts gewusst." We knew nothing about that. That phrase became almost a collective mantra. Millions of Germans claimed to be completely unaware of the crimes of the Nazi regime. And for decades, that version was accepted, or at least not systematically questioned. But the evidence accumulated by historians in subsequent decades tells a different story. A story of partial knowledge, of half-confirmed rumours, of a society that, in many cases, chose to look the other way. And here arises a question that is almost as unsettling as the Holocaust itself. What did the Allies know? What did the United States and Great Britain know, while 6 million people were being murdered? The answer, documented in archives declassified decades after the war, is devastating. As early as March 1942, a document appeared in the archives of the Office of the Coordinator of Information of the United States, the predecessor of the CIA. It was a translated copy of a dispatch sent by a Chilean diplomat stationed in Prague on the 24th of November 1941. The document clearly described the Nazi plan for the eradication of the Jews of Europe. It was given to British intelligence and then shared with US intelligence. The Allies, at a very early stage of the Holocaust, had direct information about what was occurring, and it was not the only source. Throughout 1942, the information multiplied. Police reports intercepted by British secret services, statements from eyewitnesses who managed to escape, comments from Hungarian soldiers on leave, neutral diplomatic sources. The evidence accumulated, and yet the Allied response was, at best, delayed, and at worst, negligent. On the 24th of November 1942, Rabbi Stephen Wise gave a press conference in the United States to announce the Nazi extermination campaign. Weeks later, on the 17th of December 1942, the United States, Great Britain, and 10 other Allied governments made public their knowledge of the Nazi plan to systematically murder all the Jews of Europe. But it was not until January 1944, more than a year later, that President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board. And during that year, while the Allied bureaucracy deliberated, the trains kept arriving at Auschwitz, the gas chambers kept functioning, the crematoriums kept burning. Thomas H. Baer, a member of the interagency working group that declassified these documents decades later, said something that should be engraved in the collective conscience. The warnings from the Allies to the Jews of Europe about a planned genocide never arrived. The Nazi murders depended on secrecy and subterfuge. Warnings would not have stopped the Holocaust, but they could have saved lives. They could have saved lives. Those 4 words weigh more than 1,000 documents. And while the Allies deliberated and information accumulated in classified files, the Nazis intensified their concealment efforts. Because as the war turned unfavourable for Germany, the priority was no longer just to murder, but to ensure that no evidence of the murders remained. And for that, Himmler set in motion one of the most sinister operations of the entire war, Operation 1005. Action 1005 was the code name for the Nazi plan to destroy the physical evidence of the mass murders. Himmler assigned SS officer Paul Blobel the command of this operation. Blobel, who had already commanded Einsatzkommando 4A, responsible for the Babi Yar massacre, now had a new mission: to return to the sites of the massacres and make the bodies disappear. Jewish prisoners were forced to open the mass graves, to dig up the corpses of thousands, of tens of thousands of people, and then to burn them, to reduce them to ashes, to scatter those ashes, to erase all trace of what had happened. This operation was carried out both in the extermination centres of occupied Poland and in the open-air shooting sites of the former Soviet territory. The prisoners who carried out this macabre labour were in the vast majority of cases murdered afterward to eliminate the witnesses as well. Do you understand the magnitude of what we are describing? It was not just about killing millions of people. It was about erasing the proof of their existence, to make it as if they had never lived, as if they had never been murdered, as if nothing had ever happened. That was Hitler's plan. That was Himmler's plan. That was the Nazi regime's plan. A plan of total annihilation, followed by a plan of total denial. And yet, they failed. They failed because the scale of the crime was too vast to be hidden completely. They failed because the survivors spoke, because the Allied soldiers who liberated the camps saw with their own eyes what they had done, because the Nazis themselves, in their bureaucratic obsession, left traces that they could not destroy in time. And they failed because, in one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in all of history, some of the victims themselves ensured that the truth survived. And this brings us to one of the most moving and least known chapters of the Holocaust, the buried manuscripts of Auschwitz. In the bowels of hell, in the place where death was industrialized like nowhere else in history, a group of Jewish prisoners who were forced to perform the most atrocious tasks imaginable decided that the world had to know. These prisoners belonged to the Sonderkommando, the special squads, composed mainly of Jews who were forced by the Nazis to operate the gas chambers and the crematoriums. They guided the victims to the showers. They removed the bodies from the chambers after the gassing. They extracted the gold teeth from the corpses. They loaded the bodies into the crematorium ovens. And they knew that, eventually, they too would be murdered, because the Nazis could not allow the direct witnesses to their crimes to survive. But between 1943 and 1944, several members of the Sonderkommando managed to obtain writing materials and recorded their experiences, their testimonies, what they had witnessed, what they had been forced to do. And then they buried those manuscripts in the grounds of the crematoriums, with the hope that someday someone would find them. 5 people have been identified as the authors of these manuscripts: Zalman Gradowski, Zalman Lewenthal, and Leib Langfuss, who wrote in Yiddish, Chaim Herman, who wrote in French, and Marcel Najari, who wrote in Greek. Of the 5, only Najari survived until liberation. Gradowski died in the Sonderkommando revolt on the 7th of October 1944, or was executed in retaliation for it. Lewenthal, Langfuss, and Herman were presumably murdered in November 1944, but their words survived, buried beneath the earth of Auschwitz, protected from fire and destruction. Those manuscripts were recovered after the war and became some of the most important testimonies ever written about the Holocaust. Gradowski wrote a note addressed to whoever found his writings, a note that began with a request that the world should know the truth. Those papers, known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, represent the direct voice of the victims, written in real time while the extermination was ongoing. They are not memoirs written decades later. They are not reconstructions based on memory. They are contemporary testimonies, written by people who knew they were going to die and who chose to use their final days to leave a record of what was happening. And those same prisoners of the Sonderkommando did not just leave their written testimony. They also led one of the most audacious acts of resistance of the entire war, the Sonderkommando revolt of the 7th of October 1944. How do you organize an armed rebellion in the very heart of the Nazi death machine? How do you obtain weapons and explosives when you are guarded 24 hours a day by SS guards? How do you coordinate an uprising when any suspicious movement can mean your immediate execution? The answer involves an underground network of a bravery that defies all comprehension. For months, a group of young Jewish women working in the Weichsel Union Metallwerke munitions factory within the Auschwitz complex began to smuggle small amounts of gunpowder. Every day, under constant surveillance, these women took minuscule quantities of explosives, wrapped them in pieces of cloth or paper, hid them on their bodies, and then passed them through a smuggling chain. The packages travelled in false bottoms of food containers, in the most unexpected nooks, passing from hand to hand until reaching the Sonderkommando. Rosa Robota led this group. Alongside her, Esther Weichblum, Ella Gartner, and Regina Saferstein risked their lives every day, every hour, every minute, knowing that if they were discovered, death would be immediate and likely brutal. And with that gunpowder smuggled gram by gram, the leaders of the Sonderkommando manufactured improvised grenades and rudimentary bombs. The original plan was ambitious. The Sonderkommando would coordinate with Kampfgruppe Auschwitz, the general resistance organization of the camp, to launch a massive revolt. They would cut the camp's electricity supply, disabling communications between the SS and surrounding units, and deactivating the electrified fences. They would destroy the gas chambers and crematoriums, putting an end to the industrialized slaughter. And then they would cut the wires, allowing thousands of prisoners to escape. But the plan was repeatedly postponed. The Polish underground resistance preferred to wait for the Red Army to arrive, thus improving the chances of survival. And with every day of delay, thousands more people died in the gas chambers. By September 1944, the situation became critical. The SS announced that they would transfer 200 prisoners from the Sonderkommando to another camp. But instead of transferring them, they took them to an execution site and shot them. The remaining members of the Sonderkommando understood that their turn was near, and they decided to act. On the 7th of October 1944, the revolt broke out. At 1 p.m, when the German soldiers appeared at Crematorium 4 to select prisoners for another supposed transfer, the prisoners of the Sonderkommando attacked. They threw hammers, iron bars, axes, stones. Some ran toward the crematorium building and set it on fire. The fight spread. The prisoners of Crematorium 2, seeing the flames and hearing the gunshots, joined the uprising. They attacked the guards. An Oberkapo and an SS officer were thrown alive into the crematorium oven. Another guard was killed on the spot. The prisoners cut the fence wires and began to flee toward the south. 3 SS guards died. More than a dozen were injured. Crematorium 4 was destroyed. For a brief instant, the machinery of death halted. But the revolt was crushed. The SS sent pursuit units. The prisoners who had escaped were recaptured. Approximately 250 prisoners died during the combat. Another 200 were executed afterward, forced to lie face down and shot in the back of the neck. In total, 451 members of the Sonderkommando lost their lives that day. Of the 663 that made up the group before the revolt, only 212 survived. And the 4 women who had smuggled the gunpowder, Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, Ella Gartner, and Regina Saferstein, were discovered after the investigation that followed the revolt. They were interrogated, tortured, and in January 1945, barely 3 weeks before the liberation of Auschwitz, they were publicly hanged in the camp. 3 weeks. If the Nazis had waited 3 more weeks, those 4 women might have survived. But the Nazis did not wait, because for them, the message was more important than logic. Whoever dared to challenge the machinery of death would pay with their life, no matter how close the end was. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help with the video's engagement, okay? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube keeps recommending our videos to you. And what can be said of Chaim Hermann, one of the members of the Sonderkommando, who buried his manuscript under the earth of Auschwitz? A month after the revolt, weeks before his own death, he wrote a farewell message to his family. He closed that message with words that resonate through the decades, words that combine the resignation of someone who knows he is going to die with the certainty of someone who knows that the cause he fought for was not in vain. This is what Hitler never explained. Not just the numbers, not just the 6 million, but the individual stories, the acts of resistance, the bravery in the midst of the most absolute darkness, the women who smuggled gunpowder gram by gram, the prisoners who wrote their testimonies knowing they would not live to tell them otherwise, those who chose to fight when all fighting seemed impossible. But there are more secrets, many more, and some of them remained hidden not for years, but for decades after the end of the war, because it turns out that the cover-up did not end with the fall of Berlin. In fact, in some ways, it was just beginning. What happened to the Nazis who escaped justice? What role did the CIA play in protecting Nazi war criminals during the Cold War? And what do the declassified archives reveal about the decisions that Western governments made, or decided not to make, while the Holocaust was ongoing? To answer these questions, we need to talk about the largest archive of the Nazi era that existed for over 60 years, without the public knowing it. An archive so vast, so detailed, so meticulously organized, that its mere existence contradicts the idea that the Nazis managed to erase their crimes. In the small town of Bad Arolsen in Germany, there was a facility that housed millions of Nazi documents, the largest archive in the world regarding the Nazi era. After the Allied victory, much of this archive remained hidden from the public, locked away for over 60 years. It contained meticulous records that tracked the movement and information of Holocaust victims. For some, these documents revealed how they had been saved by fortuitous circumstances. For others, they constituted indelible confirmation of their murder. Among the best-known artifacts of that archive were Oskar Schindler's list and the file tracking the movements of Anne Frank. Why did it remain closed for so long? The reasons are complex and have to do with privacy policies, disputes between governments, and according to some critics, an institutional desire not to reopen wounds. But the effect was clear. For over half a century, crucial information about the victims and perpetrators of the Holocaust remained inaccessible to researchers, survivors, and their families. And it was not the only post-war secret. In the years following Germany's defeat, the nascent Cold War reconfigured the priorities of the victors. And in that reconfiguration, the goal of pursuing and punishing the perpetrators of the Holocaust became subordinate to a new goal, containing Soviet communism. What this meant in practice was that Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, actively recruited former Nazis to work as spies and information sources against the Soviet Union. A particularly revealing case is that of Otto von Bolschwing. Before the war, Bolschwing had worked directly with Adolf Eichmann in planning the expropriation of Jewish properties in Austria. He later served as an SS consultant for the forces that organized the bloody pogrom in Bucharest, Romania, in 1941. However, in 1953, the CIA pressured the US Immigration and Naturalization Service to allow him to enter the country in recognition of his work as an informant for US intelligence. Bolschwing became a US citizen. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the US Congress forced a review of policies toward Nazi war criminals and the Office of Special Investigations was created, that Bolschwing was investigated and stripped of his citizenship. But the CIA never handed him over to the authorities. He died in 1982. How many more like Bolschwing were there? The answer, according to the declassified documents, is disturbing. The capture of Eichmann by Israel in May 1960 forced the CIA to re-examine some of the former Nazis it had recruited during the Cold War. But that review process was belated, incomplete, and in many cases, designed more to protect the agency than to serve justice. And then there are the hidden soldiers. In the small Polish village of Trawniki, the SS established a training school for mass murder. There they recruited, indoctrinated, and armed approximately 5,000 people from all over Eastern Europe, including Soviet, Ukrainian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Polish prisoners of war. These so-called Traunikis became the foot soldiers of the Holocaust, carrying out the tasks most directly linked to the murder. And after the war, many of them emigrated to the United States, lying about their activities during the conflict. They claimed they were fleeing communism. And given that US investigators had little information about the Trawniki training camp, few questions were asked. The result was that more than a dozen of these Holocaust executioners arrived in the United States on the very same military ships transporting Jewish survivors. They lived for decades in American cities and suburbs, building new lives while the families of their victims tried to rebuild theirs. The scope of this training operation in Trawniki has never been part of the mainstream discussions about the Holocaust. It is one of those secrets that remain in the shadows, known to specialists, but ignored by the general public. And yet, the killing force trained at Trawniki was responsible for the deaths of 1,700,000 Polish Jewish people in less than 20 months. 1,700,000 people in less than 20 months. And the executioners were not all members of the Nazi Party. Many were ordinary people recruited under extraordinary circumstances. This brings us to another of the uncomfortable truths that Hitler never explained, and that the Nazi regime strove to hide. The Holocaust was not the work of a single individual. It was not the exclusive consequence of the will of a megalomaniacal and paranoid leader. It was a collective project. It required the active participation, passive complicity, or deliberate indifference of millions of people, government officials who drafted the discriminatory laws, bureaucrats who organized the deportations, engineers who designed the gas chambers, businessmen who supplied the Zyklon B train conductors, who transported the victims, neighbors who denounced their Jewish compatriots, entire populations that moved into the houses, and businesses the deported Jews had left behind. The Nazis actively encouraged non-Jews to turn in their Jewish neighbors, and in many occupied countries, they found willing collaborators. In France, the Vichy government was, according to historians, fully aware of its complicity with Nazi genocidal policies. In Hungary, local authorities collaborated so efficiently with Eichmann that 600,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks during the spring and summer of 1944. And for every collaborator, there were also those who chose a different path. In Denmark, the Danish people themselves organized a rescue operation that transported 7,200 of the country's 8,000 Jews to neutral Sweden using fishing boats. In the Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, and France, underground resistance groups helped Jews hide. Across Europe, ordinary people built bunkers and hiding places in their homes, keeping Jewish families hidden for weeks, months, years, barely seeing the light of the sun, sharing their meager provisions in times of war. But these stories of rescue, although extraordinary, could not stop the machinery. And here we arrive at another of the most bitter secrets of the Holocaust, the issue of bombing the railway lines that led to the extermination camps. When the Allies already had full knowledge of what was happening in the camps, when aerial photographs clearly showed the Auschwitz facilities, an obvious question arose: why not bomb the train lines? Why not destroy the railways that transported hundreds of thousands of people directly to the gas chambers? Why not bomb the crematoriums themselves? The aerial photographs of the extermination camps were indeed taken by the Western Allies. They exist. They are preserved in archives. They show the facilities clearly. but the train lines that led to the concentration and extermination camps were not bombed. The official explanation was that they were not a military target, that aerial resources had to be concentrated on strategic targets that contributed directly to the war effort. But for many historians and survivors, that explanation was never sufficient. How many lives would have been saved if those tracks had been destroyed? How many trains packed with families on their way to death would have been stopped? It is a question that has no answer, but it is a question that has haunted the conscience of a world for over 80 years. Now let's stop for a moment. Let's breathe. Because what we have covered so far is dense, it is overwhelming, it is deliberately disturbing, but it is necessary. It is necessary because these secrets, these hidden truths, these suppressed details are the foundations upon which the greatest crime in modern history was built. And understanding them is not just an academic exercise, it is a moral imperative. So let's continue. Because there are aspects of the Holocaust that are rarely discussed, that remain on the margins of the official narrative, and that reveal layers of complexity that Hitler never would have wanted you to know. Let's talk about the conference that preceded Wannsee. Let's talk about the Madagascar Plan. Before the Nazi regime decided on the final solution as physical extermination, other plans existed. Plans that, viewed in hindsight, seem as insane as they are revealing of Nazi thinking. One of them was the so-called Madagascar Plan, the idea of deportating all the Jews of Europe to the island of Madagascar, off the southeast coast of Africa. It was a colonial fantasy disguised as a solution to the Jewish problem. The plan envisioned transporting millions of people halfway around the world to an island where living conditions would be extremely difficult, where infrastructure was virtually non-existent, and where, according to some historians, it was expected that the majority would perish from natural causes, disease, malnutrition, hostile climatic conditions, a genocide by planned neglect, so to speak. The Madagascar Plan was abandoned as unviable in times of war. British naval control of the Atlantic and the Mozambique Channel made mass transport impossible, and so the solution shifted from deportation to direct extermination, from a logistically impossible plan to a logistically efficient one, from a slow death on a remote island to an industrialized death in gas chambers. This progression is fundamental to understanding something that historians have debated for decades. Was the Holocaust planned from the beginning, or was it the result of a gradual escalation of radical decisions? The historical evidence suggests that there was no single moment of decision. There was no day when Hitler woke up and said, "Today the extermination begins." Instead, there was an escalation, from legal discrimination to segregation, from segregation to concentration, from concentration to deportation, from deportation to mass murder, and from mass murder to the industrialization of extermination. Each step made the next possible. Each threshold crossed normalized what previously would have been unthinkable. And this escalation started long before the war. It started with words. On the 16th of September 1919, a former corporal of the German army named Adolf Hitler wrote a letter that is considered his first known political statement on the Jewish question. In that letter, Hitler defined the Jewish community not as a religious group, but as a strictly racial group. He described their actions as the cause of what he called a racial tuberculosis of the peoples. He dismissed pogroms as a merely emotional response and demanded what he termed a rational anti-Semitism based on laws that would revoke the special privileges of the Jews. And the ultimate goal, he wrote, must absolutely be the complete removal of the Jews. 1919, 22 years before the start of mass extermination. And already in that letter, the seeds were planted. Complete removal. Not assimilation, not conversion, not emigration. Removal. How did a marginal ex-corporal, a failed artist, a beer hall agitator, go from writing that letter to becoming the leader of a genocidal machine that murdered 6 million people? What intermediate steps were necessary? What social, political, and economic conditions allowed that ideology to spread like a virus throughout an entire society. To understand that, we need to talk about something Hitler never explicitly explained, something historians have reconstructed piece by piece over decades: the psychological mechanism by which the Nazi regime functioned. Historian Ian Kershaw has described it as Hitler's charismatic authority, a system in which the leader did not need to give explicit orders because his subordinates worked actively to anticipate and fulfill his desires. Kershaw summarizes it with the phrase, working towards the Führer. Nazi leaders did not wait for detailed instructions. They interpreted the signals, the insinuations, the vaguely expressed desires of Hitler, and then competed among themselves to be the ones who fulfilled them best. This created a perverse dynamic in which radicalization fed on itself. Each Nazi leader tried to be more radical than the last in their interpretation of the Führer's wishes, and Hitler, from his position as supreme arbiter, approved or disapproved initiatives without needing to get directly involved in the details. This style of leadership, deliberately diffuse, deliberately ambiguous, was another of Hitler's protection mechanisms. If he didn't give explicit orders, he couldn't be held directly responsible for the consequences, or at least that was the illusion he tried to maintain. But the consequences were real, devastatingly real, and they manifested themselves not only in the extermination camps, but in every corner of occupied Europe. Let's talk about the ghettos, because before the gas chambers, before the crematoriums, before the industrial machinery of death, there were the ghettos, and the ghettos were, in themselves, machines of destruction. In hundreds of cities and towns in occupied Eastern Europe, the Nazis forced the Jewish population to concentrate in restricted areas, overcrowded, unsanitary, surrounded by walls, barbed wire, or armed guards. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of all, came to house over 400,000 people in an area of barely 3.4 square kilometers. The conditions were deliberately designed to provoke suffering: food rations insufficient to sustain life, lack of adequate medical services, extreme overcrowding that favored the spread of diseases like typhus. Every day people died of starvation, of disease, of despair. And yet, inside those ghettos, life persisted. Underground schools were organized. Secret archives were created to document what was happening. Religious services were held in hidden basements. Poetry was written. Music was composed. Human dignity was kept alive, against all logic and against all hope. One of the most extraordinary projects born in a ghetto was the secret archive of Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto. Ringelblum, a historian and social activist, organized an underground group known as Oyneg Shabbos, which dedicated itself systematically to documenting life and death inside the ghetto. They collected testimonies, statistics, diaries, essays, drawings, food wrappers, even tram tickets, anything that could serve as evidence of what they were living through. And then, when the mass deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto began in July 1942, they buried those archives in metal boxes and milk cans under the rubble of the ghetto. Part of those archives was recovered after the war. Part remains buried, perhaps forever, under the modern buildings that were constructed over the ruins of the ghetto. What was found constituted one of the most important primary sources for understanding the Holocaust from the perspective of the victims. Do you see the pattern? In Auschwitz, the members of the Sonderkommando buried their manuscripts. In Warsaw, Ringelblum's group buried their archive. In both cases, people facing imminent death devoted their final energies to preserving the truth for future generations. They knew the Nazis would try to erase all evidence, and they decided that would not happen. Hitler never explained this. He could never explain the resilience of the human spirit. He could never understand that the same bureaucratic obsession he applied to extermination would be surpassed by the obsession of the victims to leave a record of the truth. In the battle between the destroyer and the witness prevailed. But the history of the Holocaust does not end in the extermination camps and the ghettos. There are chapters that remain in the shadows, less known, less discussed, and yet reveal dimensions of the genocide that are fundamental to understanding its total magnitude. Let's talk about the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads. Because if Auschwitz is the most recognized symbol of the Holocaust, the Einsatzgruppen represent its rawest, most direct, most viscerally brutal face. The Einsatzgruppen were paramilitary units of the SS that followed the German army in its advance through Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Their mission was simple in its cruelty: murder Jews, Romani people, Soviet political commissars, and any other group considered an enemy of the Reich. And their method was equally direct: mass shootings, out in the open, in plain sight of soldiers, and in many cases, local civilians. The procedure was methodical. The Einsatzgruppen arrived in a city or a town. They rounded up the Jewish population, often with the help of local collaborators. They forced them to march to a secluded place, usually a ravine, a forest, or the outskirts of the settlement. They made them undress, and then they shot them row after row, layer upon layer, filling pits that in some cases contained thousands of bodies. The most emblematic case, though not the only one, was Babi Yar. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, in a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, the troops of Einsatzgruppe C, along with police units and local collaborators, murdered over 33,000 Jews in barely 48 hours. The victims were forced to walk to the edge of the ravine, where they were shot and fell to the bottom. Many did not die immediately, but were left wounded among the bodies of the already deceased, and were buried alive when the next wave of victims fell upon them. And Babi Yar was not an isolated event. Throughout the occupied eastern territories, the Einsatzgruppen executed similar massacres. In Rumbula, near Riga, Latvia, more than 25,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days, in November and December 1941. In Ponary, near Vilnius, Lithuania, between 70,000 and 100,000 people were executed between 1941 and 1944. In Kamianets-Podilsky, in Ukraine, over 23,000 Jews were murdered in 3 days at the end of August 1941, in what is considered one of the first large-scale massacres of the Holocaust. In total, it is estimated that the Einsatzgruppen and associated units murdered between 1 million and 1,500,000 people, mostly Jews, in the occupied eastern territories. These murders occurred largely before the construction of the extermination camps. They are what historians call the Holocaust by bullets, in contrast to the Holocaust by gas that followed it. And here lies one of the most uncomfortable truths that Hitler never explained. The Holocaust did not start with gas chambers. It started with bullets. It started with people who looked their victims in the eyes and pulled the trigger. And this required a level of dehumanization, of indoctrination, of moral destruction that goes beyond what most people can comprehend. How do you turn a normal person into a mass murderer? How do you make someone who before the war was a family father, an office clerk, a university student, capable of shooting a child? This question has tormented historians, psychologists, and philosophers since the end of the war, and the answers they have found are as disturbing as the crime itself. Ideological indoctrination was a crucial factor. Years of anti-Semitic propaganda had dehumanized Jews in the minds of millions of Germans. Jews were not presented as people. They were presented as parasites, as a disease, as an existential threat to the German nation. When propaganda reduces a human group to the category of vermin, when it systematically eliminates their humanity in the collective imagination, the step from discrimination to extermination becomes psychologically easier. You are not killing people. You are eliminating a threat. That was the perverse logic of the Nazi regime. But ideology alone does not explain everything. Peer pressure, obedience to authority, alcoholism as an escape mechanism, and the gradual nature of the process also played a role. The executioners did not go from being ordinary citizens to mass murderers overnight. It was a gradual process. First, they participated in acts of intimidation, then in acts of minor violence, then in arrests, then in deportations, and finally, in murders. Each step normalized the next. Each threshold crossed made the next one easier to cross. And when some executioners could not continue, when they suffered nervous breakdowns or refused to shoot, they were generally not punished. They were simply transferred to other duties, which means that those who kept shooting did so, in most cases without direct coercion. They did it because the combination of ideology, social pressure, obedience, and gradual desensitization had transformed their moral capacity in such a way that murder became a routine. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. Not monsters, not psychopaths. Ordinary people embedded in a system that allowed, encouraged, and rewarded them for killing. And this is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of the Holocaust, because if the genocide was perpetrated not by monsters, but by ordinary people, then the question we must ask ourselves is not, how could they do that? But how can we ensure that we never do something similar? But let's leave this reflection for a moment and return to the secrets. Because there is another aspect of the Holocaust that Hitler tried to keep hidden, and that reveals the depth of Nazi planning: medical experiments. In the concentration and extermination camps, the Nazis conducted medical experiments on living prisoners, experiments that had no legitimate scientific justification, experiments that were, in reality, forms of torture disguised as science, and the details of these experiments were suppressed, classified, and in many cases destroyed by the perpetrators themselves before the end of the war. In Auschwitz, the most infamous name associated with these experiments is that of Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. Mengele made selections on the arrival ramp of the trains, deciding with a flick of his finger who lived and who died. And among those who lived, he specifically selected twins, people with unusual physical characteristics, people with dwarfism, to subject them to his experiments. The details of these experiments are difficult to describe without feeling repulsion: injections of unknown substances, surgeries without anesthesia, deliberate exposures to diseases, progressive freezing, atmospheric pressure tests, every procedure designed without any consideration for the suffering of the subject. And Mengele was not the only one. In Dachau, hypothermia experiments were conducted, submerging prisoners in ice water for hours to study the effects of extreme cold. In Ravensbrück, bone grafting and muscle regeneration experiments were conducted on female prisoners. In Sachsenhausen, prisoners were forced to walk extreme distances to test the performance of military footwear. The list is long and shuddering. And what happened to those responsible for these experiments after the war? Some were tried at Nuremberg, others escaped. Mengele fled to South America and lived the rest of his life as a fugitive, dying in Brazil in 1979 without ever having faced justice. Other Nazi scientists were recruited by the Allies, particularly by the United States, through programs like Operation Paperclip, which sought to exploit German technical and scientific expertise for the nascent space race and the Cold War. The moral irony is crushing. Scientists who had participated in or benefited from research conducted in concentration camps were welcomed by the very countries that had liberated those camps. Their files were cleansed, their Nazi histories minimized or deleted, and for decades they contributed to space, military, and intelligence programs in the countries that presented themselves as the defenders of freedom and human rights. This is what Hitler never explained, but what history has gradually revealed, that the legacy of Nazism did not end on the 8th of May 1945, that the secrets of the Holocaust were hidden not only by the Nazis during the war, but by Western governments after it. That justice was, in many cases, sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical convenience, and that the victims of the Holocaust were betrayed not once, but repeatedly, first by the perpetrators, then by the bystanders, and finally by the liberators who chose strategic utility over accountability. Is it a harsh statement? Yes. Is it a documented statement? Yes, as well. And that is precisely the reason why these secrets matter. Not because we seek to assign retroactive blame, but because the complete historical truth is the only foundation upon which an honest collective memory can be built. And an honest collective memory is the only real antidote against repetition. Now, there is another secret we must address, one that is directly related to the way the Nazis tried to justify, rationalize, and ultimately hide their genocidal ideology. And it has to do with a concept that was at the very heart of Nazi thinking, eugenics. By the end of the 19th century, eugenics became a popular movement in the Western world. The basic idea was that humanity could be improved through the selection of desirable genetic traits and the elimination of the undesirables. This pseudoscience categorized people into races with immutable characteristics. The Nazis took these ideas, which were already circulating in academic and political circles in Europe and America, and took them to their most monstrous logical extreme. For the Nazis, the Aryan race represented the pinnacle of human evolution. All other races were inferior to varying degrees, and Jews in particular were presented not simply as an inferior race, but as an anti-race, a destructive force that had to be eliminated to preserve the purity of the German people. This racial ideology was not invented by Hitler. It had deep roots in European culture. Since the 16th century, the myth of the superiority of the Frankish or Germanic race over the Gallo-Roman race existed in France. The German journalist Wilhelm Marr, considered the creator of the term anti-Semitism, promoted the attack on Jews as a race and not as followers of a religion. Henry Ford, the American automobile magnate, openly published anti-Semitic texts. The Dreyfus Affair in France, the pogroms in Russia under Tsar Nicholas II. What the Nazis did was systematize, institutionalize, and radicalize these pre-existing currents until they became state policy. And then, when the consequences of that policy manifested in their most extreme form, in mass extermination, they tried to hide them. And this brings us back to the beginning, to the fundamental secret, to the question that opens this narrative. Why did Hitler never sign the order? Why did the Nazi regime use euphemisms? Why did they destroy documents, burn bodies, erase mass graves? Because they knew. They knew that what they were doing was a crime of unprecedented magnitude. They knew that the world, if it ever discovered the full truth, would condemn them. And they knew that their only defense would be denial. We didn't know. We didn't participate. It didn't exist. But it did exist. And the evidence proves it irrefutably. The manuscripts buried in Auschwitz prove it. The Wannsee minutes prove it. The speeches of Himmler recorded in Posen prove it. The testimonies of the survivors prove it. The confessions of the perpetrators prove it. The photographs taken clandestinely by members of the Sonderkommando, images smuggled out of the camp hidden in a tube of toothpaste, prove it. The Bad Arolsen archives prove it. The documents declassified by Allied governments decades after the war prove it. The Yizkor books, those memory books written by survivors immediately after the war, documenting the life of destroyed Jewish communities the Nazis wanted to erase, not only physically, but from the very memory of humanity, prove it. The Yizkor books are, in many cases, the only remaining source about the inhabitants of small European Jewish communities. They record the history of the shtetls, those small Jewish populations of Eastern Europe. They include lists of inhabitants, descriptions of life before and during the war, photographs, personal memoirs. They are the last vestige of entire worlds that ceased to exist. Worlds with schools, synagogues, markets, families, dreams, laughter. Worlds the Nazis wanted to erase completely. But they couldn't. Because memory is stronger than destruction. Because the testimonies buried under the earth of Auschwitz survived the ovens that tried to incinerate them. Because copy number 16 of the Wannsee Protocol survived, the other 29 that were destroyed. Because the Yizkor books were written by survivors, who refused to let their communities be forgotten, because every act of preserving the truth was an act of resistance as powerful as the explosives smuggled by Rosa Robota. And because we, decades later, continue telling this story, we keep naming the victims, we keep exposing the secrets, we keep refusing to forget. But do you know what is the most unsettling thing of all? That the very method of secrecy designed by the Nazis continues to function, to a certain extent, to this day. Not because the evidence does not exist, but because there are those who choose to ignore it. Holocaust denial, the deliberate assertion that the genocide did not occur as established historiography describes it, remains present in public discourse. Figures who claim that the gas chambers never existed, that the victim numbers are exaggerated, that the confessions were obtained under coercion, that the documents are forgeries. These claims have been exhaustively refuted by historians, by courts of law, by physical, documentary, and testimonial evidence. The case of David Irving, a self-proclaimed historian who sued the academic Deborah Lipstadt for defamation after she described him as a denier, is illustrative. The British court that tried the case concluded that Irving was a racist and anti-Semitic falsifier of history, associated with right-wing extremists promoting neo-Nazism. The ruling was categorical and devastating. And yet, denialism persists. It adapts. It disguises itself as academic revisionism. It spreads through social media and internet forums. It feeds on ignorance, prejudice, and the comfort of believing that something so monstrous could not have really happened. But it happened. And the secrets we have explored in this journey prove it with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. Every euphemism used by the Nazis confirms that they knew they were committing a crime. Every destroyed document confirms that they tried to hide it. Every mass grave exhumed and burned confirms that they were terrified that evidence would be discovered. And every manuscript buried by the victims, every hidden archive, every smuggled photograph confirms that the truth was stronger than the lie. Now, there is a particularly little-known aspect that we must explore, an aspect that connects directly to the way the Nazis organized the logistics of the extermination, the role of the railways. The trains were, literally, the arteries of the Holocaust. Without the railways, the deportation of millions of people from every corner of Europe to the extermination camps in occupied Poland would have been logistically impossible. And the organization of those transports was a chilling example of bureaucratic efficiency applied to mass murder. The deportees traveled in freight cars designed for cargo, not for people. Overcrowded, without water, without food, without sanitary facilities. The journeys could last for days. Temperatures were extreme, suffocating in summer, freezing in winter. Many people died during the trip, and those who survived the journey arrived at their destination in a state of weakness, confusion, and despair that made it easier for the Nazis to lead them directly to the gas chambers. And who organized these transports? It wasn't just the SS. It was the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German state railway system. Railway officials planned schedules. Drivers operated locomotives. Station personnel supervised departures and arrivals, all within a bureaucratic structure that treated the transport of human beings to their death as if it were the transport of any other cargo. Adolf Eichmann was the main logistical coordinator of these deportations. From his office in Berlin, he organized the transports with an obsessive meticulousness. Every train, every route, every schedule was planned to maximize the efficiency of the process. And when the deportations of Hungarian Jews reached their peak in the spring of 1944, Eichmann managed to send 600,000 people to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks. 600,000 people, entire families, complete communities, transported like cattle to their deaths, and the bureaucratic machinery that made it possible function with the same routine with which any railway system functions: timetables, itineraries, load capacities, track maintenance. The normalization of genocide reduced to schedule tables. And what happened to the victims' assets? Because the Holocaust was not just an extermination project. It was also, and this is another of the truths Hitler never explained openly, a theft project on a continental scale. The Nazis stripped their victims of absolutely everything. Before deportation, their properties, bank accounts, businesses, artworks, jewelry were confiscated. Upon arriving at the camps, their clothing, footwear, and personal belongings were taken. In the gas chambers, their gold dental prosthetics were ripped out. Their hair was cut, sent to German factories to be used in textiles. The suitcases of Auschwitz prisoners, found after liberation, some with the names of their owners handwritten, are a silent testimony to this systematic plundering. The Holocaust generated a flow of stolen wealth toward the Nazi state and toward individuals within the regime. Dental gold melted down and converted into ingots, confiscated currencies, invaluable works of art stolen from private Jewish collections, real estate transferred to Aryan hands, and after the war, the restitution of those assets was a long, complicated, and in many cases incomplete process that continues to this day. There is a detail within this machinery of plunder that is particularly revealing. When the first victims of the Holocaust were buried in mass graves, no special effort was made to hide the bodies. But as the regime became aware of the need for secrecy, the methods changed. Corpses began to be incinerated in huge crematoriums, and some Jews were forced to participate directly in the murder process, and then were executed themselves to maintain the secret. It is a self-contained circle of death. The victims become instruments of their own destruction, and then they are destroyed in turn, and those who destroyed them are destroyed later. Layer upon layer of death, layer upon layer of silence. But the silence was broken, and it continues to be broken every time we tell this story, every time we name a victim, every time we document a fact, every time we refuse to accept the lie of "we knew nothing." And what happened when the camps were finally liberated? What did Allied soldiers find when they crossed the gates of Auschwitz, of Bergen-Belsen, of Dachau, of Buchenwald, of Mauthausen? They found mountains of corpses. They found prisoners reduced to living skeletons. They found irrefutable evidence of atrocities that surpassed anything they could have imagined. And many of those soldiers, hardened by years of combat, broke down emotionally at what they saw. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, deliberately visited the Erdrich camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, because he wanted to be a first-hand witness. He wanted to be able to give personal testimony of what he had found, so that if ever in the future anyone tried to deny that these things had happened, he could refute them with the authority of someone who had seen it with his own eyes. Eisenhower also ordered that German civilians from the towns near the camps be brought to tour the facilities, so they could see with their own eyes what had been done into their name. And the photographs and films taken during the liberation of the camps became the foundation for the Nuremberg trials, the first international war crimes tribunal in history. When the war drew to a close in 1944 and 1945, the Nazis embarked on a final, desperate campaign to destroy evidence. They burned documents. They dismantled the extermination camps. They demolished the crematoriums. And they forced the remaining prisoners on brutal death marches, forced evacuations in which thousands of people, weakened by years of captivity, were made to walk hundreds of kilometers in extreme cold conditions without food or shelter. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were executed on the spot. Those who tried to escape were shot. The death marches were the final Nazi attempt to erase the evidence. If the prisoners died along the way, far from the camps, there would be no witnesses at the facilities when the Allies arrived. But once again, the plan failed, because the Allies advanced faster than expected, because some prisoners managed to escape during the marches, because the camps could not be completely destroyed in time, and because the evidence was simply too much to be erased entirely. At the end of the Second World War, when the Mauthausen camp was liberated by the Allies, 200,000 people had passed through its barracks. Approximately 120,000 had died within its walls. At Auschwitz, the camp was liberated by the Red Army on the 27th of January 1945. It is estimated that 1,100,000 people were deported to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, and that approximately 1 million died there. Most were Jews, and the majority were never registered as prisoners because they were sent directly to the gas chambers upon arrival, without going through the registration process. This last point is crucial to understanding another dimension of Nazi secrecy. Many of the Auschwitz victims left no documentary trace whatsoever in the camp's records. They arrived by train, they were selected on the ramp, and they were murdered in the gas chambers without their name, their age, their origin ever being recorded. They simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. And that was exactly the goal. But history refused to forget them. Families refused to forget them. Survivors refused to forget them. And we refused to forget them. How many more secrets remain to be discovered? How many documents remain classified in government archives of various countries? How many individual stories are still untold? It is impossible to know for sure. What we do know is that every declassified document, every recovered testimony, every academic investigation that sheds light on the dark corners of this history contributes to dismantling the architecture of secrecy that Hitler and his regime meticulously built. And now, before continuing to delve into the most hidden layers of this story, I want us to reflect on something. I want us to pause and think about the meaning of what we have explored so far. We have spoken of a regime that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of other people, including Romani and Sinti, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissidents, a regime that not only murdered, but tried to erase all evidence of its crimes, a regime that used coded language so its own documents would be indecipherable, a regime whose supreme leader never signed the extermination order so he could deny his direct involvement, a regime that forced its own victims to destroy the evidence of their death. And in the face of all that, we have spoken of people who, from the depths of the most unimaginable suffering, chose to resist. They chose to document, they chose to write, they chose to smuggle gunpowder gram by gram, they chose to bury manuscripts under the earth, they chose to risk their lives so the world would know the truth. That is the fundamental tension of this story, the tension between destruction and preservation, between imposed silence and rescued truth, between denial and memory. And in that tension, memory has prevailed, not without cost, not without sacrifice, but it has prevailed. And now we are going to enter even darker territory, because there are Holocaust secrets that were not only hidden during the war, but were actively suppressed for decades afterward, secrets that involve governments, financial institutions, private companies, and organizations that collaborated with the Nazi regime in ways that are only now being fully documented. Did you know that Swiss banks held accounts of Holocaust victims for decades, refusing to return the funds to their rightful heirs? Did you know that German companies that today are globally recognized names use slave labor from the concentration camps? Did you know that escape networks organized by sectors of the Catholic Church helped Nazi war criminals flee Europe for South America after the war? Each of these topics deserves a deep exploration, and each reveals a different dimension of the complicity that made the Holocaust possible and that facilitated the impunity of many of its perpetrators. Let's start with the Swiss banks. During the war, many European Jews deposited their savings in Swiss banks, trusting in the neutrality and discretion of that country's financial system. When those Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, their surviving families, if there were any, tried to recover those funds. But the Swiss banks demanded death certificates for people who had been gassed in secret chambers, incinerated in crematorium ovens, buried in anonymous mass graves. People whose death was never officially documented because the Nazis ensured that it wouldn't be. The demand for death certificates for Holocaust victims was in practice a second expropriation. The Nazis stole their lives, the banks stole their legacy, and this scandal did not come to public light until the 1990s, more than 50 years after the end of the war, when a series of investigations and legal lawsuits forced the Swiss banks to acknowledge what they had done. In 1998, a class action lawsuit filed in US courts resulted in a settlement of $1,250 million from the two largest banks in Switzerland. But for many survivors and their families, the financial compensation, however important it was, could not repair decades of denial, obstruction, and what many perceived as a second victimization. And Swiss banks were not the only financial actors that benefited from the Holocaust. The Chase National Bank of New York itself maintained operations with Nazi Germany during the war. Declassified documents revealed that Chase executives avoided federal prosecution for violating various US laws when the bank's lead attorney threatened to reveal FBI, Army and Navy sources and methods in open court. The German corporations that used slave labor from the concentration camps are another chapter that remained largely in the shadows. Companies like IG Farben, the massive chemical corporation that produced the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers, and that operated an industrial plant adjacent to Auschwitz using prisoners as forced laborers, was dissolved after the war. But successor companies like Bayer, BASF, and Hearst continued operating and thriving for decades before IG Farben's role in the Holocaust was fully recognized and compensation funds were established. Krupp, Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, Benz. The list of companies that use slave labor from the concentration camp system is long. Debilitated, malnourished prisoners, subjected to inhumane working conditions, labored in factories producing everything from munitions to rocket components, generating profits for corporations that, after the war, successfully reinvented themselves in the new European economy. The belated recognition of this history and the establishment of compensation funds are important steps, but they do not erase the fact that for decades, these truths were actively suppressed or minimized by the very companies involved, and in some cases, by the governments that protected them. And then there are the ratlins, the escape routes. After the war, a network of organizations, individuals, and according to some researchers, elements within the Catholic Church itself facilitated the flight of Nazi war criminals from Europe to safe havens, mainly in South America, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile. These countries became refuges for Nazi fugitives who had participated directly in the Holocaust. Adolf Eichmann lived in Argentina under a false identity for more than a decade before being captured by the Mossad in 1960. Josef Mengele lived in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was protected by US intelligence before being helped to escape to Bolivia, where he lived for decades before being extradited to France in 1983. These are not isolated cases. They are part of a systematic pattern in which the prosecution of Nazi war criminals was consistently sacrificed in favor of geopolitical interests. And this pattern was, for a long time, another of the secrets that surrounded the Holocaust. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a habit of coming to the surface. And one by one, decade after decade, the secrets of the Holocaust have been revealed, not by the will of the powerful, but by the persistence of researchers, the determination of survivors, and humanity's collective refusal to accept that the truth can be permanently suppressed. And this is where I want to stop to ask you a question that has no simple answer, but that is perhaps the most important of all the ones we have raised in this journey. Why does it matter? Why more than 80 years later do we keep unearthing these secrets? Why do we keep telling this story? Why do we dedicate hours, days, years, entire lives to documenting and understanding something that happened so long ago? The answer lies in a phrase that has been repeated so often, it runs the risk of becoming a cliché, but which contains a profound truth. Those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. And the Holocaust did not occur in a parallel universe. It did not occur in a distant, primitive civilization. It occurred in the heart of Europe, in one of the most educated, most cultured, most technologically advanced countries in the world. It was perpetrated by people with university degrees. It was planned in elegant villas by lakes. It was executed with industrial precision. And it was tolerated by an international community that had enough information to act, but that chose, time and time again, not to do so. If that could happen then, in those circumstances, what makes us think it cannot happen again? What protection mechanisms exist today that did not exist then? And are those mechanisms sufficient? These are not rhetorical questions, they are urgent questions. Because anti-Semitism did not disappear with the fall of the Third Reich. Because racism, xenophobia, hatred of the different remain powerful forces in the contemporary world. Because the dehumanization of the other, that essential first step on the staircase to genocide, remains a tool used by political leaders, by mass media, by social media algorithms to divide, polarize, and pit societies against each other. And that is why we tell this story, not to stay trapped in the past, but to arm the future with the knowledge of what human beings are capable of doing, both the worst and the best. Because next to the stories of destruction, there are the stories of rescue. Next to the executioners are the righteous. Next to Crematorium 4 at Auschwitz are the women who smuggled gunpowder. Next to the machinery of death are the buried manuscripts. Next to the darkness is the light that refused to be extinguished. And that light, that small, persistent, indestructible light, is the reason why you are listening to this right now. It is the reason why these words exist. It is the reason why the truth, despite all efforts to destroy it, has survived. But there is still much more to tell, many more secrets to reveal, many more layers to uncover. And in the next part of this narrative, we are going to enter even less explored territories. We are going to talk about the children of the Holocaust, the most innocent and most invisibilized victims. We are going to explore the secret projects that the Nazis developed in the bowels of their subterranean fortresses. We are going to discover what happened to the objects stolen from the victims, from priceless works of art to the gold teeth extracted from the mouths of the dead. And we are going to confront, finally, the most difficult question of all. Has humanity learned the lesson? What would happen if I told you that one of the greatest acts of resistance of the Holocaust was carried out by a woman who measured barely 1 meter 50 centimeters? That this woman managed to smuggle 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, one by one, hiding them in burlap sacks, in toolboxes, in coffins, in ambulances, and that she buried the real names of each of those children in glass jars under an apple tree, hoping that someday, when the nightmare ended, the families could be reunited, and that this story remained practically unknown for almost 60 years. Because that is exactly what happened, and it is one of the brightest secrets inside the most impenetrable darkness of the Holocaust. Her name was Irina Sendler, born on the 15th of February 1910 in Warsaw. Irina Sendler was a Polish Catholic social worker who served in the Polish underground resistance during the Second World War in German-occupied Warsaw. From October 1943, she was head of the children's section of Zagota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews. But her story begins much earlier. It begins with her father. Irina's father, Dr. Stanislaw Krzyżanowski, was a physician who died in February 1917 of typhus contracted while treating patients his colleagues refused to treat out of fear of contagion, many of them Jews. After his death, Jewish community leaders offered his mother help to pay for Irina's education. That gesture of solidarity remained engraved in Irina's memory forever. Decades later, when the Nazis locked hundreds of thousands of Jews behind the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto, Irena remembered the kindness of that community that had helped her family in their most difficult time, and she decided it was her turn to return that kindness, even if doing so meant risking her life every day, every hour, every minute. Around 400,000 Jewish people were crammed into a tiny portion of the city, designated as the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Nazis sealed the area in November 1940. The Nazis rationed approximately 200 calories of food per person per day. Death by starvation was common. Sanitary conditions were abysmal, with garbage and human corpses piling up in the streets. Irena found a way in. Due to Irena's work with the Warsaw Department of Health and Social Services, she received a pass from the Epidemic Control Department that allowed her official passage into the ghetto. She immediately began making daily visits, sometimes multiple times a day, to smuggle food, money, and typhus vaccine doses inside the ghetto. While in the ghetto, she wore a Star of David as a sign of solidarity with the Jewish people. Can you imagine that? A Polish Catholic woman walking through the streets of the ghetto with a yellow star on her arm, risking her life not out of obligation, not by order, but by conviction. By the simple, powerful, unshakable conviction that what was happening was wrong and that she could do something to change it. But what Irena saw inside the ghetto changed her forever. She saw children dying in the streets. She saw families falling apart. She saw how the ghetto was not a place of confinement, but a place of slow and deliberate extermination. And she decided that she could not limit herself to bring in food and medicine. She had to get the children out of there before it was too late. Knowing what awaited them there, Irena was devastated that she could not find an alternative solution. She swore that she would never return a single child to the ghetto, and she began, along with her associates, an operation to smuggle Jewish children out of the ghetto and provide them with false Polish identities and safe homes on the Aryan side of the city. The penalty for helping a Jewish child in wartime Warsaw was execution, and Irena and her core group of between 20 and 25 operatives, mostly women, risked their lives daily to save each child. How did they get the children out? The methods were as ingenious as they were desperate. Some children were smuggled in burlap sacks and body bags, others in a mechanic's toolbox, in ambulances, and even in coffins. Sendler enlisted the active assistance of the church in her work. Some children were taken through a door of a church in the ghetto and came out through another door in the free zone, emerging with new Christian identities. Think about it, babies hidden in toolboxes, toddlers stuffed into burlap sacks, with instructions not to move, not to cry, not to make a single sound while being transported past Nazi guards. Slightly older children who had memorized Catholic prayers, so they could pretend to be Christians if interrogated. Every single one of those rescues was an act that could end with the death of Irena, her collaborators, and the child itself. And even so, they did it, time and time again, day after day. Irena carefully noted the true names and relatives of the little ones in code and buried the list in jars under a neighbour's apple tree, with the hope of one day digging up the jars and reuniting the families. The list was in the package that Sender threw out the window that day, and it was reburied by her companion. Approximately 2,500 children's names were in the jars. 2,500 names. 2,500 lives. Written on thin strips of tissue paper, coded so that if they fell into Nazi hands, they could not be deciphered, and buried under an apple tree. While the machinery of death operated at full speed a few kilometers away, those jars remained under the earth, keeping the most precious secret imaginable, the identity of 2,500 children who had been snatched from the jaws of the Holocaust. But the Gestapo reached Irena. On the 20th of October 1943, Irena Sendler threw a package out the window to a friend waiting below, who quickly hid it under her arm. Coming up the stairs were 9 Nazi soldiers, ready to arrest her for her work with the Polish resistance. Sendler was sent to the infamous Pawiak prison, where she was tortured to reveal the names of her co-conspirators and the contents of that package. The small package contained a list of the true identities of thousands of Jewish children that Sendler and her team had smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto. They tortured her. They broke her feet and legs. They tried to extract information from her by every means imaginable, but Irina did not speak. She did not reveal a single name. She did not betray any collaborator. She did not betray a single one of the 2,500 children whose lives depended on her silence. Arrested by the Gestapo in the fall of 1943, Sendler was sentenced to death. Zagota rescued her before her execution. She assumed a new identity and continued her work for Zagota. Did you hear that? She was sentenced to death. The Polish resistance managed to bribe the guards to release her. And instead of hiding, instead of running away, instead of retreating to a safe place, Irina assumed a new identity and kept rescuing children. She kept going, after the torture, after the death sentence, after everything they had done to her. And the most extraordinary thing about this story is perhaps what happened after the war. The young woman who saved 2,500 Jewish children from the Nazis saw how her story and that of her fellow rescuers remained buried for almost 60 years. The world knew Oskar Schindler, whose story was immortalized by Steven Spielberg, but the woman who saved more than twice as many people as Schindler remained in obscurity. It was not until 1999, when 4 students from a rural high school in Kansas, United States, found a brief reference to Sendler in a magazine article, that her story began to be known worldwide. The students were intrigued by a sentence their teacher showed them. In an article that said simply, Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 and 1943. Both the teacher and the students were convinced it must be a typo. How could one person save 2,500 children from the walled and heavily guarded ghetto? Soon after, they received a letter from the foundation saying that Sendler was alive. She was over 90 years old and lived modestly in Warsaw. A woman who had saved 2,500 lives, who had been tortured by the Nazis, who had been sentenced to death, who had continued her rescue work even after all that. And she lived in anonymity, unknown by the world, because her story was one of those secrets that time had buried. Do you see why this matters? Do you see why every Holocaust secret we unearth is a victory against forgetting? Because behind every secret there is a story like Irina Sendler's, a story of inconceivable bravery, a story that the Nazis tried to destroy, and that the passage of time almost managed to erase, but that survived, like the jars under the apple tree. Now, the story of the children of the Holocaust does not end with the rescues. There is a much vaster, much more painful dimension that is rarely explored in depth, and that is the dimension of the children who were not rescued. Jewish children were the most vulnerable victims of the Nazis. 1,500,000 children perished during the Second World War. 1,500,000. Let's pause on that number. 1,500,000 children. Children who never grew up, who never went to school, who never played in a park, who never fell in love, who never had children of their own, who never grew old. 1,500,000 futures erased from existence. 1,500,000 stories that will never be told. 1,500,000 laughs that were never heard. And what happened to the children who survived in hiding? Children were kept in cellars and attics, where they had to remain silent, even motionless for hours. The cruelty of the Nazi regime and the barbarities of war forced some children to mature far beyond their years. A child survivor described them as old people with children's faces, without a trace of joy, happiness, or childish innocence. Old people with children's faces. That phrase should be engraved in the conscience of humanity. Children who had seen too much, who had suffered too much, who had lost everything, their parents, their homes, their names, their identity, their childhood. Some Jewish children survived the Holocaust because they were protected by people and institutions of other religions. The children quickly learned to master the prayers and rituals of their adopted religion to keep their Jewish identity hidden. I had to keep my Jewishness hidden, secret, to never be revealed under penalty of death. Children hidden during the Holocaust faced significant trauma during and after the Second World War. The most important thing was that, except when the child was hidden with at least one parent, the child had effectively lost all parental support during the war. Younger children were often too young to remember their parents. However, they suffered the extreme trauma of separation from their parents. Although they did not remember this trauma consciously, it remained in their subconscious and in most cases had an impact on their future behavior. And when the war ended, what awaited them? For a considerable number of hidden children, the end of the war did not bring an end to traumatic experiences. After the war, Jewish parents frequently spent months and years searching for the children they had sent into hiding. In fortunate cases, they found their children with the original rescuer. Many, however, turned to tracing services, newspaper ads, and survivor registries hoping to find their children. Time and again, the family search ended in tragedy. For parents, it was the discovery that their child had been murdered or had disappeared. For the hidden children, it was the revelation that there were no surviving relatives coming to claim them. The Catholic Church had baptized many Jewish children during the war to hide them as Catholics, but after the war often refused to reunite the children with their Jewish relatives. Do you understand the magnitude of that tragedy? Children who had been saved from the Holocaust, who had survived hidden in convents, orphanages, foster homes, discovered at the end of the war that their parents were dead, that their families had been exterminated, that they had no one, and in some cases, the institutions that had protected them refused to return them to the Jewish community, arguing that the children had been baptized and were now Catholics. Irina Sendler had foreseen this. That is why she had noted down the real names of the children. That is why she had buried them in jars. Irina always made it clear to the families, convents, and orphanages that took the children in that they must be returned to their families after the war. She kept her detailed lists for this reason, so the families could reunite. But for the majority of those 2,500 children, there was no family to return to. The jars contained names that no longer had faces waiting on the other side, names whose parents, whose grandparents, whose siblings had been murdered in Treblinka, in Auschwitz, in the streets of the ghetto itself. The jars preserved the identity, but they could not preserve the families. And this leads us to a painful but necessary reflection. The Holocaust did not end with the liberation of the camps. For the survivors, the trauma continued for decades. The hidden children grew up with invisible but deep scars. Many did not speak of their experiences for years, even decades. For months, even years, they faced the constant danger of being discovered, fabricating new identities at an early age, sacrificing their childhood to save their lives. These secret survivors suppressed these painful memories for decades. Now some of them are sharing their experiences for the first time. How many more secrets remain buried, not under apple trees, but in the memories of survivors who never found the words or the audience to tell what they lived through? How many stories were lost forever when the last witness died without having been able to share their testimony? These questions haunt us, and they should haunt us. Because every untold story is a posthumous victory for the Nazis who tried to erase all evidence of their crimes. And every story that is told, every testimony that is preserved, every name that is recovered, is an act of justice that transcends time. But now let's change direction, because there is another secret of the Holocaust that remained literally hidden behind the walls of a Munich apartment. for over 60 years. A secret that, when discovered, caused a worldwide shock, and that revealed a dimension of the Holocaust that is often eclipsed by the magnitude of the human tragedy, the systematic theft of cultural heritage. We are talking about the Görlitz Hoard. One of the greatest stories of Nazi looting of Jewish-owned art began with a routine customs check on a train from Zurich to Munich in September 2010. When customs agents stopped Cornelius Görlitz, an elderly resident of Munich, it turned out he was carrying an unusually large sum of cash. The money, which was barely within the legal limit, apparently came from an art sale in Bern. Bavarian authorities decided to investigate his affairs and in early 2012 carried out an inspection of his Munich apartment. They were astounded to discover it packed with art, more than 1,200 pieces. They assumed he might have been dealing in secret and confiscated them for their investigation. More than 1,200 pieces of art in an ordinary Munich apartment, hidden by a solitary old man who lived like a recluse. Where did those works come from? And who was Cornelius Görlitz? The Görlitz collection was a trove of around 1,500 works of art inherited by Cornelius Görlitz, the son of one of Hitler's official art dealers, Hildebrand Görlitz, and which was discovered to contain several works of art looted from Jews by the Nazis. In February 2012, in a Munich apartment belonging to an elderly recluse, German customs authorities confiscated 1,280 paintings, drawings, and prints by artists such as Picasso, Monet, Matisse, Chagall, Otto Dix, and Paul Klee. Picasso, Monet, Matisse, Chagall, Otto Dix, Paul Klee, masterpieces of modern art that the world believed lost or destroyed, hidden for decades in a cluttered apartment, and behind each of those works a story of expropriation, of persecution, of Jewish families stripped of their cultural heritage. One of the 4 art dealers appointed by the Nazi propaganda ministry to oversee the liquidation of degenerate art, purged from German museums, was Dr. Hildebrand Görlitz. The son of a highly respected art historian, Görlitz served as a museum director in Zwickau until he was fired in 1930 for exhibiting modern art. But that background positioned him to be useful to the Nazi propaganda machine when the regime sought to sell thousands of confiscated modernist works to obtain foreign currency. The irony is devastating. An art dealer who supposedly championed modern art became an instrument of the regime that despised that very art. And in the process, he amassed an invaluable collection, much of which had been torn from the hands of Jewish collectors persecuted by the Nazis. There were undoubtedly pieces in the hoard that had been expropriated from Jewish owners in Germany and France. The initial investigation by the task force established 5 proven cases, including a Matisse from the stock of Parisian dealer Paul Rosenberg, who had put it in storage in 1940 when he fled France to the United States. Another painting was a Pissarro that had belonged to Max Heilbronn, from the family that owned the Galeries Lafayette in Paris. And what happened to the collection after the discovery? 8 years after the discovery of the hidden hoard of artworks belonging to Cornelius Görlitz, a team of investigators completed its investigation into the collection's provenance, with only a handful of conclusive answers. Of the 1,590 artworks examined by the German Lost Art Foundation, only 14 were definitively recognized as looted and returned to the heirs of their rightful owners. The provenance of another approximately 1,000 artworks remains unresolved. Did you hear that? Only 14 works returned out of a total of more than 1,500, and the provenance of approximately 1,000 works remains undetermined. Why? Because the Nazis were meticulous in destroying ownership records, because many of the original collectors were murdered, along with their entire family, leaving no heirs who could claim the works, because the passage of time has erased trails that were already difficult to trace, and because, as we have seen throughout this entire narrative, secrecy was the Nazi regime's most powerful weapon. The Görlitz case is not an isolated episode. It is the visible manifestation of a much larger problem. With the rise of National Socialism in Germany, the largest art theft in world history began even before the outbreak of the Second World War. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 650,000 works of art were confiscated or forcibly sold by the Nazis throughout Europe. Only a small fraction has been returned to its rightful owners. 650,000 works of art, and only a small fraction returned. It has been estimated that the Nazis stole around 600,000 artworks from Jewish communities, collectors, museums, and people living in the territories they illegally occupied during the Second World War. However, there are around 100,000 pieces of art that are displaced and still missing today. 100,000 missing works of art, 100,000 pieces of humanity's cultural heritage that are somewhere, in some attic, in some private collection, in some bank vault, waiting to be found, or perhaps destroyed forever. And behind each of those works is a human story. The story of a family that collected them with love, that hung them on the walls of their home, that shared them with their children and grandchildren. Families who were stripped of everything, of their artworks, of their properties, of their businesses, of their dignity, and finally, of their lives. Victims of Nazi concentration and extermination camps were forced to undress completely before being murdered, and all their personal belongings were stolen. The most valuable items, such as gold coins, rings, eyeglasses, jewelry, and other precious metal objects, were sent to the Reichsbank to be converted into ingots. The value was then credited to SS accounts. The plunder was total, absolute, from masterpieces of European painting to the gold teeth of corpses, from the art collections that decorated the mansions of the most refined Jewish collectors in Europe to the worn-out shoes of concentration camp prisoners. Everything was confiscated. Everything was recycled. Everything was turned into capital to feed the war machine and the personal greed of Nazi leaders. And now, let me ask you something. Did you know that Hermann Göring, the second in command of the Reich, personally accumulated one of the largest collections of stolen art in history? Göring appropriated hundreds of works from Jewish collectors and galleries from all over Europe. His personal collection included more than 1,500 pieces. He personally visited the depots where confiscated works were stored and selected the ones he liked best, like a shopper in a luxury store, except the store was the cultural heritage of a continent, and the salesman had been murdered or deported. And Hitler himself had his own plans for the stolen art. He dreamed of building an enormous museum in the Austrian city of Linz, his adopted hometown, which would house the largest art collection in the world. The so-called Führer Museum would be the crown jewel of the new German Empire, a monument to Aryan cultural greatness, built upon the foundations of theft and destruction. For this project, Hitler commissioned a special team, directed by Hans Posse and later by Hermann Voss, to collect artworks from all over Europe. Thousands of paintings, sculptures, engravings, and decorative art objects were selected and stored for this museum that was never built. In the ruins of Hitler's Third Reich, Allied occupation forces found millions of paintings, books, manuscripts, and sculptures hidden in thousands of secret stashes. A group of dedicated monuments, fine arts, and archives officers fought to restore Europe's cultural heritage. Caught up in often bitter diplomatic disputes during and after the war, the US restitution effort fought to unearth and return what the Nazis had hidden. These officers, popularly known as the Monuments Men, found masterpieces of Western art hidden in salt mines, underground tunnels, isolated castles, bank vaults, and military depots, millions of pieces, scattered all over Europe, and the task of cataloguing them, identifying their original owners, and returning them was a process that, as we have seen with the Gerlich case, continues to this day, more than 80 years after the end of the war. But now let's return to the main narrative. Because there are secrets of the Holocaust that do not involve documents, artworks, or statistics. They involve something much more fundamental: the psychology of extermination. The way the Nazis designed every step of the process to maximize efficiency and minimize resistance. And this engineering of deception is perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of the whole story. How do you convince hundreds of thousands of people to walk voluntarily into the gas chambers? How do you get entire families to undress, say goodbye to their belongings, and enter a room from which they will never leave without a massive panic breaking out? The answer is deception. A carefully designed, rehearsed, and perfected deception. When trains arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, deportees were received by Sonderkommando prisoners dressed in relatively clean clothes who told them they had arrived at a labor camp, that they had to undress to take a disinfection shower, that their belongings would be returned later, that they would be reunited with their relatives later on, that everything would be fine. The Nazis had designed the gas chambers to look like communal showers. They installed fake shower heads on the ceilings. They placed signs that said showers and disinfection on the walls. They even provided numbered hooks for victims to hang their clothes, suggesting they would retrieve them later. Everything was calculated to maintain the illusion until the very last moment, to prevent panic, to ensure that victims entered the chambers without resistance. At Treblinka, the path from the unloading ramp to the gas chambers was lined with trees and decorated with signs mimicking a train station, including a fake clock, destination signs, and a fake luggage room. All fake. All designed so victims would believe they had arrived at a transit point, not an extermination centre. At Sobibor, similar tactics were used. Paths lined with flowers, signs pointing to the showers, polite instructions from guards who had been specifically trained to maintain calm among the victims. And what happened when someone grew suspicious? When someone resisted? The Nazis had protocols for that too. Guards acted with sudden brutality against anyone who showed signs of resistance, to intimidate the rest of the group and prevent suspicion from spreading. At Auschwitz, Sonderkommando members who revealed the truth to the victims were murdered immediately. The deception had to be maintained at all costs, because without the deception, the machinery could not operate with the efficiency the Nazis required. This level of psychological planning is profoundly disturbing, because it shows that the Nazis not only planned the mass murder, but they also planned the emotional manipulation of their victims. They studied human behavior. They anticipated reactions. They designed environments that exploited people's hope, trust, and survival instinct to lead them more efficiently toward death. They did not settle for killing. They made sure their victims cooperated involuntarily in their own murder. And why did Hitler never explain this? Because this level of premeditation, of cold calculation, of psychological manipulation would destroy any possibility of presenting the Holocaust as anything other than what it was: a planned, industrialized crime executed with full awareness of its monstrosity. And here we reach a crucial point in this narrative, a point that connects everything we have explored so far. Because Nazi secrecy was not simply a security measure, it was an implicit confession of guilt. Every euphemism was an admission that what they were doing was criminal. Every destroyed document was an admission that they knew the world would condemn them. Every incinerated mass grave was an admission that the evidence of their crimes was irrefutable. And every gas chamber disguised as a shower was an admission that they knew their victims, if they knew the truth, would fight to the death. Secrecy was the Nazis' most eloquent confession, and that confession, inscribed in every aspect of their extermination machinery, is the definitive refutation of any attempt to deny, minimize, or relativize what happened. Let's pause here. Let's breathe. Because what comes next explores territory that few narratives about the Holocaust dare to tackle in depth. What happened to the survivors, not during the war, not in the camps, but afterward? What awaited them on the other side of liberation? Because liberation was not a happy ending. not for the majority. Liberation was the beginning of a new ordeal. A different ordeal, yes, but an ordeal nonetheless. When the camps were liberated, the remaining prisoners were in devastating physical conditions. Many weighed less than 35 kilograms. Many suffered from diseases that would kill them in the weeks and months following liberation. The Allied soldiers who opened the gates of Bergen-Belsen found over 60,000 prisoners, the majority gravely ill. In the weeks following liberation, approximately 14,000 of them died, despite Allied medical efforts, because their bodies were too weakened to recover. And those who survived physically faced an existential void of unimaginable proportions. Where to go? Their homes had been destroyed or confiscated. Who to reunite with? Their families had been murdered. What to do? Their communities no longer existed. Holocaust survivors found themselves, literally, with nothing, without a home, without a family, without a community, without a country, without a visible future. Hundreds of thousands of survivors spent years in displaced persons camps, waiting for the opportunity to emigrate somewhere they could rebuild their lives. Palestine, which would become the State of Israel in 1948, was the destination for many. The United States, Canada, Australia, various Latin American countries took in others, but the process was long, bureaucratic, and in many cases disheartening. Survivors who tried to return to their homes in Eastern Europe frequently found that their properties had been occupied by neighbours who had no intention of returning them. In some cases, they were met with open hostility. In the Polish city of Kielce, on the 4th of July 1946, more than a year after the end of the war, a mob attacked a group of Jewish survivors who had returned to the city. 42 people were murdered, Holocaust survivors, murdered by their own neighbours after the war. The Kielce pogrom was one of the most traumatic post-war events for the surviving Jewish community, and it provoked a massive wave of emigration of Jews out of Poland. Do you see? The hate did not end with the war. The violence did not end with the liberation of the camps, and the suffering of the survivors did not end with the fall of the Third Reich. These are uncomfortable truths, truths that Hitler never explained because he did not live to face them, but which are fundamental to understanding the total magnitude of the Holocaust and its consequences. And among those consequences, there is one that deserves special attention: intergenerational trauma. Because the Holocaust did not only affect those who lived it directly, it affected their children, their grandchildren, generations who were born decades after the camps were liberated, but who grew up in the shadow of a trauma their parents and grandparents could never fully overcome. The children of Holocaust survivors, the so-called second generation, grew up in homes marked by silence, by night terrors, by a diffuse but omnipresent fear, by the absence of grandparents, uncles, cousins they never knew, because they were murdered before they were born. Psychological studies have documented patterns of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress in the second and third generations of survivor families, patterns that suggest the trauma of the Holocaust was transmitted in complex and often invisible ways across generations. Research in the field of epigenetics has even raised the possibility that extreme trauma can leave biological marks that are transmitted genetically. Although this field of research is still young and its conclusions are debated, the idea that the suffering experienced by one generation can be literally inscribed in the DNA of following generations is a powerful metaphor for something survivors and their families have intuitively known all along: that the Holocaust did not end in 1945, that its effects reverberate through time, that the wound, though scarred over, never completely closed. And now, with this perspective in mind, let's return to the central question of this narrative. What are the secrets of the Holocaust that Hitler never explained? They are more than hidden documents and covert operations. They are the stories of 2,500 children saved by a woman measuring 1.50 meters. They are the manuscripts buried under the earth of Auschwitz by prisoners who knew they were going to die, They are the photographs smuggled in toothpaste tubes. They are the jars under the apple tree. They are the artworks found in a Munich apartment 60 years after the war. They are the testimonies of survivors that the world took decades to listen to. They are the invisible scars transmitted from generation to generation. But there are still more layers to uncover. And in this final stretch of our narrative, we are going to address the secrets that connect the past with the present. Because the Holocaust is not just history, it is a warning. And that warning becomes more urgent with every passing year. Let's talk about something that few narratives on the Holocaust address with the depth it deserves: Jewish resistance. Because one of the most persistent and most damaging myths about the Holocaust is the idea that European Jews were passive victims, that they marched to their deaths without a fight, that they accepted their fate with resignation. This narrative is false, and it is one of the secrets the Nazis actively tried to suppress. Jewish resistance took many forms. The most visible form, armed resistance, included uprisings like that of the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, the most famous of all. For almost a month, a group of approximately 750 Jewish fighters, armed with a handful of pistols, rifles, homemade grenades, and Molotov cocktails, faced the most powerful army in Europe. The fighters knew they could not win in a military sense. They knew defeat was inevitable, but they chose to fight anyway. They chose to die with a weapon in hand, not in a gas chamber, and their resistance forced the Germans to deploy troops, heavy artillery, and flamethrowers to subdue an area they had expected to liquidate in 3 days, but which held out for 27. And the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was not the only one. There were uprisings in the ghettos of Białystok, Vilnius, Częstochowa, Bedzin, and many others. There were Jewish partisans who fought in the forests of Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland. The Bielski brothers led a partisan group that not only fought the Nazis, but created a community in the Belarusian forests that saved over 1,200 Jewish people. And we have already talked about the Sonderkommando revolt in Auschwitz and the women who smuggled the gunpowder. But the resistance was not only armed, it was also cultural, spiritual, intellectual. Ringelblum's secret archives in the Warsaw Ghetto were an act of resistance. Clandestine schools in the ghettos were acts of resistance. Religious ceremonies held in secret were acts of resistance. The simple decision to survive, to maintain human dignity, under conditions designed to destroy it, was an act of resistance. As one survivor said, the act of living was in itself an act of resistance. Every day we survived was a defeat for the Nazis. And the Nazis knew this. That is why they tried to suppress all evidence of Jewish resistance, because resistance contradicted their narrative of racial superiority. If the Jews were the inferior race that Nazi propaganda proclaimed, how was it possible that they resisted with such bravery? How was it possible that 750 fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto held the German army at bay for almost a month? The answer was uncomfortable for the regime, and for that reason, official German reports on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising systematically downplayed Jewish resistance. General Jürgen Stroop, commander of the ghetto liquidation operation, drafted an official report illustrated with photographs, in which he presented the destruction of the ghetto as a routine military operation. But the reality was very different. The reality was that a group of poorly armed, malnourished fighters, aware of their fate, chose the dignity of resistance over the submission of passive death. And that is something Hitler could never explain, because explaining it would have meant admitting his racial ideology was a lie. And speaking of lies, there is another secret we must address before concluding. A secret that does not belong to the past, but to the present. A secret that has to do with the way the Holocaust is remembered, represented, and in some cases, distorted in the contemporary world. Holocaust denial is perhaps the ultimate and most persistent form of Nazi secrecy, not because it is promoted by the Nazis, who no longer exist as an organized political movement, but because it fulfills the same function as the original secrecy, to hide the truth, to deny that the crimes occurred, to erase the evidence from collective memory. And denial does not always take the crude form of claiming the Holocaust did not exist. Sometimes it is more subtle. Sometimes it presents itself as skepticism or revisionism. Sometimes it questions the numbers without denying the event itself. Sometimes it relativizes by comparing the Holocaust to other historical events to minimize its uniqueness. Sometimes it simply changes the subject, suggesting that talking about the Holocaust is excessive or unnecessary, or that everything has already been said. But not everything has been said, not by a long shot. As we have seen throughout this narrative, there are secrets that took decades to come to light. Declassified documents, recovered testimonies, found artworks, stories of resistance rescued from oblivion. And each of these discoveries reinforces the same conclusion. The Holocaust was real, it was planned, it was massive, and it was deliberately hidden by its perpetrators. And now, before closing this journey, I want to talk about something that is rarely mentioned in Holocaust narratives, but that is fundamental to understanding why this history remains relevant: the lessons for the future. The Holocaust did not start with gas chambers. It started with words, with hate speech, with the dehumanization of a group of people through language. Parasites, plagues, subhumans. Each of these terms was a brick in the construction of the extermination machine. Because when a human group is reduced to the category of vermin in the collective imagination, killing them no longer seems like a crime. It seems like a hygiene measure. And this lesson is urgent, because the language of dehumanization did not disappear with the fall of the Third Reich. It is still present in contemporary political discourse. It is still present on social media. It is still present in the rhetoric of extremist movements that, using the same tools the Nazis perfected, identify a group as the enemy, strip them of their humanity through language, and then justify violence against them as a measure of self-defense or protection of society. The Holocaust also teaches us about the dangers of indifference. The Allies knew, the German population knew, at least partially, neutral countries knew, and yet the response was, in far too many cases, inaction. Indifference is not neutrality. Indifference is a form of complicity. And every time we choose to look the other way, when a human group is persecuted, every time we decide it is not our problem, every time we prefer the comfort of silence over the discomfort of action, we are repeating the pattern that made the Holocaust possible. And finally, the Holocaust teaches us about the power of individual resistance. Irina Sendler was a social worker. The Sonderkommando members who buried their manuscripts were prisoners. Rosa Robota was a young woman who smuggled gunpowder gram by gram. Emmanuel Ringelblum was a historian. The inhabitants of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon were Protestant farmers in a small French village. None of them was a world leader. None had an army. None had political power. And yet each of them, in their own way, defied the most destructive machine humanity has ever created. The lesson is clear. You don't need to be powerful to resist. You don't need to be a leader to make a difference. You don't need an army to fight against injustice. All you need is the will to act, the will to say this is wrong, the will to risk something, anything, to do what is right. And with that reflection, let's close the circle. At the beginning of this narrative, we asked a question. What would happen if I told you that the darkest chapter of modern history was designed so you would never know about it? Now you know part of the answer. You know the euphemisms the Nazis used to disguise their crimes. You know the strategy of the missing signature, Hitler's deliberate design to avoid leaving written evidence of his direct responsibility. You know the Wannsee Protocol and copy number 16 that survived the other 29. You know the Posen speeches where Himmler spoke openly of extermination to a select group of generals. You know Operation 1005, the plan to destroy all physical evidence of mass murders. You know the manuscripts buried under the earth of Auschwitz by Sonderkommando members. You know Rosa Rabota and the women who smuggled gunpowder. You know Irina Sendler and the jars under the apple tree. You know Ringelblum's secret archives. You know the Gurlitt hoard and the 650,000 stolen works of art. You know Allied negligence and the declassified documents revealing how much Western governments knew. You know the escape routes that allowed Nazi criminals to flee justice. You know the complicit silence of Swiss banks and corporations that benefited from slave labour. And you know the stories of hidden children, of survivors who rebuilt their lives from nothing, of generations carrying a trauma they did not choose but inherited. These are the secrets of the Holocaust that Adolf Hitler never explained, because explaining them would have meant admitting the magnitude of his crime, and because his plan was always that no one would know them. But you know them. Now you know them. And that knowledge is, in itself, an act of justice. Because every person who knows this history becomes a witness, and every witness is a barrier against oblivion. And oblivion is the only thing that can allow something like this to happen again. So do not forget. Do not let others forget. Share this story. Talk about it. Because memory is not a passive act. Memory is an act of resistance. Memory is an act of bravery. Memory is how we honour the 6 million who were murdered, the survivors who rebuilt their lives, the rescuers who risked everything, and the witnesses who buried their testimonies under the earth so that someday someone would find them. That day is today, and those testimonies are here, in this narrative, in your knowledge, in your memory. And what can you do with all this? You can start by remembering. You can start by questioning. You can start by rejecting the language of hate when you hear it. You can start by asking what stories are not being told, what secrets remain buried, what truths need to come to light. You can start by being the kind of person who, faced with injustice, chooses to act instead of looking the other way. Because that is what Irina Sendler did. That is what the Sonderkommando members did. That is what the women who smuggled gunpowder did. That is what the people of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon did. That is what the archivists of the Warsaw Ghetto did. Ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, who chose dignity over submission, truth over silence, justice over comfort. And now, allow me to close with something that connects everything we have explored. A final reflection that, I hope, remains with you long after this narrative ends. The Nazis built a destruction machine unprecedented in history. They mobilized industrial, bureaucratic, logistical, and military resources to murder 6 million Jews and millions of other people. They designed a system of secrecy to hide their crimes. They burned documents. They destroyed bodies. They erased mass graves. They coded their language. They manipulated their victims. And when defeat became inevitable, they tried to destroy all remaining evidence. But they failed. They failed because the truth is more resilient than the lie. They failed because the manuscripts buried under the dirt of Auschwitz survived. They failed because copy number 16 of the Wannsee Protocol escaped destruction. They failed because Irina Sendler did not speak under torture. They failed because the Monuments Men found millions of hidden works of art. They failed because the survivors spoke. They failed because the children and grandchildren of the survivors kept speaking. And they failed because you, right now, are listening to this story. Every time this story is told, the Nazis lose a little more. Every time a victim's name is remembered, the machinery of destruction takes a step back. Every time an act of resistance is documented, the narrative of passivity crumbles. And every time someone, anywhere in the world, decides that the Holocaust must not be forgotten, humanity wins a small but significant victory against the darkness. That is the true lesson of the secrets of the Holocaust that Adolf Hitler never explained. It is not just a lesson about the past. It is a lesson about the present and about the future. It is a lesson about what human beings are capable of doing at their worst and about what they are capable of doing at their best. It is a lesson about destruction and about resistance about hate, and about compassion, about death, and about the life that refused to be extinguished. The jars under the apple tree contained 2,500 names, 2,500 futures, 2,500 proofs that even in the bowels of hell, someone chose hope over despair. And that hope, preserved in glass jars, in buried manuscripts, in smuggled photographs, in whispered testimonies from generation to generation, is the most powerful legacy of the Holocaust. More powerful than the gas chambers, more powerful than the crematoriums, more powerful than the entire machinery of the Reich. Because destruction has an end, but memory does not. Memory has no end. And as long as memory exists, the secrets Hitler tried to erase will keep coming to light, one by one, year after year, generation after generation. Because the truth, like the manuscripts buried under the earth of Auschwitz, always finds a way to resurface. This was everything. Until the next video. And remember, our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers. It seems like a lot, but with your help, we can achieve it. If this story impacted you, if you learned something you did not know, if you believe that more people should know these secrets, then subscribe, give it a like, share this video, and be part of this mission to preserve memory, because memory is the last line of defense against repetition, and that line depends on each of us. Tell us in the comments, which of the secrets we explored today impacted you the most? Which one did you not know? And which one do you believe humanity should always remember above all the others?